Welcome, history lovers. Journey with us beyond the gilded portraits and sanitized textbooks to uncover the scandalous and hidden truths of England's most famous dynasty. This is Untold Secrets of the Tudors, where every story reveals a new, shocking piece of the puzzle. Prepare for history to be rewritten. Untold Tudor Secrets: What History Books Left Out. Part 1. The Shadow King, Henry VII Paranoid Court. The reign of Henry VII, often depicted as a staid and administrative prelude to the more flamboyant personalities of his successors, was in reality a kingdom built upon a foundation of pervasive fear and deep-seated paranoia, a court where the whispers in the corridors were as potent as any edict proclaimed in the open. The very legitimacy of his claim to the throne, secured through the bloody and decisive Battle of Bosworth Field, was a constant source of anxiety, a phantom limb that ached. With the memory of the Wars of the Roses and the ever-present threat of a Yorkist resurgence, this was not a court of lavish celebrations and chivalric romance, but rather a meticulously constructed web of surveillance and psychological control, where every nobleman, every courtier, and even every servant was a potential pawn in a game of dynastic survival. Henry, having witnessed firsthand the brutal and fickle nature of power, trusted few and suspected many, employing a network of spies and informants that would have made Sir Francis Walsingham, his granddaughter's spymaster, proud. These agents were not just concerned with the great lords of the realm, whose loyalty was always a matter of pragmatic calculation, but also with the mutterings in taverns, the prophecies of so-called holy men, and the circulation of seditious rumors that could ignite the embers of rebellion. The king's paranoia manifested in a complex system of bonds and recognizances, financial instruments, that held the nobility in a state of perpetual debt and obligation to the crown. A single misstep, a careless word, or an association with a known dissident could trigger the activation of these crippling debts, leading to financial ruin and social disgrace, a far more effective and less bloody means of control than the executioner's axe. This created an atmosphere of stifling conformity, where outward expressions of loyalty were paramount, yet genuine allegiance was a rare and precious commodity. The court itself was a carefully managed stage, designed to project an image of stability and permanence that belied the king's inner turmoil. The architecture of his new palaces at Richmond and Greenwich was imbued with Tudor symbolism. The portcullis of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, and the intertwined red and white roses, a constant visual reminder of the new order. Yet, behind this facade of dynastic confidence, Henry was a man haunted by the ghosts of the past, particularly the mystery of the princes in the Tower. The disappearance of Edward IV's sons, while politically convenient, also provided a fertile ground for pretenders to the throne, most notably Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. The appearance of these impostors, who managed to garner significant support both domestically and from foreign powers, was not merely a political nuisance, but a profound psychological blow to Henry, confirming his deepest fears that his grasp on the crown was tenuous at best. The king's reaction to these threats was a mixture of calculated military response and a sophisticated propaganda campaign, but it also revealed a more personal, obsessive side to his nature. He personally interrogated Warbeck, not out of a desire for justice, but from a desperate need to understand the mechanics of the deception, to peel back the layers of the conspiracy and expose its roots. This obsession with security extended to his own family. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, was a masterful political stroke intended to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Yet it was a union born of necessity, not affection. Elizabeth and her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, were kept under constant, albeit subtle, surveillance, their correspondence intercepted, their every visitor noted. The king's own mother, the formidable Margaret Beaufort, was one of the few people he seems to have trusted implicitly, her piety and political acumen providing a steadying influence in a court rife with intrigue. The day-to-day life at court was a reflection of the king's cautious and methodical nature. Extravagance was curtailed, replaced by a focus on fiscal responsibility and the accumulation of wealth. Henry understood that a full treasury was a more potent symbol of power than any number of lavish tournaments. This financial prudence, however, also fueled resentment among the nobility, who felt that the king was more of a bookkeeper than a monarch, his court lacking the grandeur and largesse they had come to expect. Yet, it was this very accumulation of wealth that allowed Henry to fund his intelligence network, to pay for the loyalty of mercenaries, and to bribe foreign ambassadors, creating a buffer of security that was as financial as it was military. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense, not just on the king, but on the entire court. It was a world of double meanings and veiled threats, where a seemingly innocent question could be a test of loyalty, and a casual remark could be reported back to the king's council. This atmosphere of suspicion inevitably led to a culture of betrayal, as courtiers sought to advance their own positions by denouncing their rivals, often on the flimsiest of evidence. The king, in his desperate search for security, had created a court that was a mirror of his own paranoid mind, a place where the shadows held more power than the light, and where the unspoken secrets of the past were a constant and unsettling presence. Part 2. The Lost Princes, a Tudor Foundation Myth? The enduring mystery of the princes in the Tower, the two young sons of Edward IV who vanished from the Tower of London in 1483, is not merely an unsolved crime, but a foundational myth of the Tudor dynasty. A dark and ambiguous event that was skillfully manipulated to legitimize the reign of Henry VII and cast his predecessor, Richard III, as the archetypal villain. While the traditional narrative, immortalized by Shakespeare, places the blame squarely on the shoulders of a Machiavellian, Richard, a closer examination of the historical evidence, or lack thereof, reveals a far more complex and unsettling picture, one in which the Tudor regime had as much, if not more, to gain from the prince's disappearance and the subsequent blackening of Richard's name. The very story of the murder, as it has been passed down through the centuries, originates almost entirely from Tudor sources, most notably Sir Thomas More's History of King Richard III, a work written decades after the events it purports to describe and penned by a man who was a loyal servant of the Tudor court. More's account, with its vivid and theatrical details of the smothering of the young princes with their pillows, is a masterpiece of political propaganda, designed to be both emotionally compelling and politically devastating for the now-defeated House of York. It is a narrative that serves a clear and singular purpose: to present Henry Tudor as the savior of England, a righteous avenger who rescued the kingdom from the clutches of a monstrous usurper and child killer. Yet, a critical analysis of the timeline and the political realities of the period raises significant questions about the veracity of this official Tudor version of events. Richard III's claim to the throne was based on the premise that his brother Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and therefore their children, including the two princes, were illegitimate. This declaration enshrined in the Act of Parliament, known as Titulus Regius, effectively disinherited the boys and removed them from a line of succession. From a purely political standpoint, with the princes officially declared bastards, the immediate necessity for their murder was significantly diminished. They were a potential rallying point for dissent, to be sure, but their physical elimination was not the only, or even the most logical, course of action for a king seeking to consolidate his power. The possibility that one or both of the princes survived their uncle's reign cannot be so easily dismissed, and it is in this possibility that the Tudor interest in their disappearance becomes alarmingly clear. The pretenders Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, who emerged during Henry VII's reign claiming to be the lost Yorkist heirs, posed a far greater threat to the new Tudor king than they ever could have to Richard III. For Henry, a usurper with a tenuous claim to the throne himself, the existence of a legitimate Yorkist heir was a dynastic nightmare, a constant and potent challenge to his authority. It was therefore absolutely essential for the Tudor regime to establish, beyond any doubt, that the princes were dead and that Richard III was their murderer. This narrative not only eliminated any potential rivals, but also justified Henry's own seizure of the crown as a moral imperative. The so-called confession of Sir James Tyrrell, extracted under torture years later, is another piece of evidence that is highly suspect. torture, as a means of obtaining information, is notoriously unreliable, and Tyrrell's confession, which conveniently corroborated the official Tudor story in every detail, has all the hallmarks of a coerced and politically motivated statement. The fact that the bodies of the two children discovered in the tower in 1674 were never definitively identified as those of the princes, despite being interred in Westminster Abbey with great ceremony, further complicates the issue. Modern scientific analysis, were it to be permitted, could potentially shed new light on the identity of these remains, but the refusal of the royal family to allow such an examination only adds to the suspicion that the official story may not be the whole truth. The very ambiguity surrounding the prince's fate was a powerful political tool for Henry VII. By keeping the mystery alive, by allowing rumors to circulate while simultaneously promoting the official narrative of Richard's guilt, he could continue to paint the Yorkists as a source of instability and division, further solidifying his own position as the unifier of the nation. The story of the lost princes became a cautionary tale, a dark fairy tale that served to remind the English people of the chaos and bloodshed of the Wars of the Roses and the supposed tyranny of the last Plantagenet king. It was a story that was repeated in chronicles, ballads, and plays, becoming so deeply embedded in the national consciousness that it has been accepted as historical fact for centuries. Yet it is a story that is built on a foundation of circumstantial evidence, hearsay, and politically motivated testimony. The untold secret of the Tudors may not be the answer to the question of what happened to the princes, but rather the story of how their disappearance was transformed into a powerful and enduring piece of political propaganda, a myth that was as essential to the foundation of the Tudor dynasty as the crown that Henry VII won at Bosworth Field. Part 3. Anne Boleyn's Secret Faith, the Evangelical Queen. Anne Boleyn, forever etched in the popular imagination as the seductive and ambitious homewrecker who brought about the downfall of a queen and the schism of a church, was in reality a figure of profound and deeply held religious conviction, a secret evangelist whose personal faith was a driving force behind the English Reformation. To cast her simply as a pawn in Henry VIII's dynastic ambitions is to fundamentally misunderstand the intellectual and spiritual currents of the age, and to ignore the compelling evidence that suggests Anne was not merely a catalyst for change, but one of its most ardent and influential architects. Her years spent in the sophisticated and intellectually vibrant courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude of France exposed her to the new wave of humanist thought and the burgeoning ideas of the Protestant reformers. This was a world where the writings of Erasmus and Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples were discussed with fervor, where the calls for a purification of the Church and a return to the scriptural sources of Christianity found a receptive audience among the educated elite, and a woman of sharp intellect and a keen interest in theology absorbed these ideas, not as abstract intellectual exercises, but as a deeply personal and transformative spiritual awakening. She returned to England not as the naive young girl who had left, but as a woman with a mission, a secret convert to the evangelical cause who saw in the king's desire for a divorce an opportunity to advance the cause of religious reform. Her personal collection of books, many of which were prescribed as heretical in England at the time, is a testament to the depth and sincerity of her beliefs. She owned and annotated copies of William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament, a work that was banned by the authorities and had to be smuggled into the country. This was not a casual act of intellectual curiosity, but a profound and dangerous statement of faith, an embrace of the central Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura, the belief that the Bible alone is the ultimate authority in matters of faith, and that every individual has the right to read and interpret it for themselves. This belief was a direct challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church and the papacy, and it was a belief that Anne actively sought to promote within the English court. She surrounded herself with a circle of reform-minded chaplains and scholars, including Thomas Cranmer, who would become the Archbishop of Canterbury and a key figure in the English Reformation. It was Anne who championed Cranmer's appointment, recognizing in him a fellow traveler on the path to reform. She used her influence over the king, an influence that was undoubtedly rooted in his passionate and obsessive love for her to promote evangelical preachers and to protect those who were being persecuted for their beliefs. Her personal motto, "The Most Happy," was not, as is often assumed, a reflection of her worldly success, but rather a statement of her spiritual contentment, her belief that true happiness was to be found in a personal relationship with God, unmediated by the elaborate rituals and hierarchical structures of the Catholic Church. The charges of adultery, incest, and witchcraft that were ultimately brought against her were a grotesque caricature of her true character, a politically motivated fabrication designed to remove her from the political stage and to clear the way for the king's marriage to Jane Seymour. Yet, even in these trumped-up charges, we can see a distorted reflection of the threat that she posed to the conservative faction at court. The accusation of witchcraft in particular was a common tactic used to discredit women who were perceived as being too powerful, too intelligent, and too independent. In Anne's case, it was also a way of demonizing her religious beliefs, of casting her as a heretic who had bewitched the king and led him astray from the true faith. Her famous speech on the scaffold, in which she commended the king and asked for the prayers of the people, has often been interpreted as a sign of her submission to the will of the king and the state, but it can also be read as a final and subtle act of defiance, a carefully worded statement that avoided any admission of guilt while simultaneously affirming her faith in God's ultimate justice. The untold secret of Anne Boleyn is not that she was a secret Protestant, a fact that has been acknowledged by many historians, but rather the extent to which her personal faith was a driving force in the political and religious turmoil of the age. She was not simply a victim of Henry's lust and ambition, but an active and engaged participant in the great religious debates of her time, a woman who risked everything, including her life, for her beliefs. Her legacy is not just that of a tragic queen, but of a pivotal figure in the history of the English Reformation, a woman whose secret faith helped to shape the course of a nation and the future of a church. Part 4. The Dissolution's Black Market, Monastic Loot and Hidden Fortunes. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, officially portrayed as a righteous act of religious reform and a necessary measure to reclaim wealth for the crown, was also the catalyst for one of the largest and most audacious operations of asset stripping and black market dealing in English history. Beyond the royal commissioners and their meticulously recorded inventories of lead, bells, and silver plate, there existed a shadowy and illicit economy, a frantic scramble for the vast and portable wealth of the religious houses, where local gentry, opportunistic officials, and even the monks themselves engaged in a widespread campaign of looting, concealment, and illegal sales. This was not merely a matter of a few stolen chalices or hidden candlesticks, but a systematic and often highly organized effort to divert a significant portion of the monastic treasures away from the royal coffers and into private hands. The very process of the dissolution, which was carried out in stages and often with advance warning, created a window of opportunity for those with an eye for profit. Monks and abbots, facing the imminent seizure of their homes and livelihoods, had a powerful incentive to collude with local landowners and merchants to sell off monastic assets at a fraction of their true value. Precious manuscripts, illuminated with gold leaf and bound in jeweled covers, were sold for pennies to those who recognized their artistic or intellectual worth, or simply for the value of the precious metals they contained. Reliquaries encrusted with gems and said to contain the bones of saints were broken up, their sacred contents discarded, their jewels and silver melted down, and sold on the burgeoning black market. The scale of this illicit trade was staggering, and it was facilitated by a network of corrupt officials and middlemen who were willing to turn a blind eye to the looting in exchange for a share of the profits. The royal commissioners, themselves tasked with overseeing the dissolution, were often not immune to the temptations of easy wealth. Men like Thomas Cromwell's agents, while publicly committed to serving the king's interests, were also in a prime position to identify the most valuable items and to arrange for their disappearance before they could be officially recorded. This created a climate of rampant corruption and opportunism, where the line between legal seizure and outright theft was often blurred. The local gentry, in particular, were major beneficiaries of this black market. For centuries, they had been the patrons and protectors of the local monasteries, and they had an intimate knowledge of their wealth and treasures. As the dissolution loomed, many saw it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire land, silver, and other valuable assets at bargain prices. They would offer to safeguard monastic treasures, only to have them conveniently disappear, or they would use their influence to intimidate the monks into selling off their most valuable possessions for a pittance. This not only enriched the local elites, but also fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape of the countryside, concentrating wealth and power in the hands of a new class of Tudor landowners. The monks and nuns themselves were not always passive victims in this process. While many were undoubtedly devout and were heartbroken to see their way of life destroyed, others were more pragmatic, seeking to salvage what they could from the wreckage. There are numerous accounts of monks and nuns secretly selling off church plate, vestments, and other valuables in the months and even years leading up to the dissolution. This was not always an act of personal greed, but often a desperate attempt to provide for their own futures in a world that had been turned upside down. The money they raised from these illicit sales could be used to buy a small plot of land to set themselves up in a trade, or simply to provide a dowry for a niece or a sister. The hidden fortunes that were amassed during this period were not just in the form of gold and silver. The vast libraries of the monasteries, containing priceless collections of manuscripts and early printed books, were also plundered. While some of these were saved by antiquarians like John Leland, who was commissioned by the king to survey the monastic libraries, many more were lost, sold as scrap parchment, or simply left to rot. Yet for those who recognized their value, these books were a source of immense intellectual and cultural capital, a hidden treasure trove of knowledge that could be used to advance their own careers and to shape the intellectual currents of the age. The dissolution's black market, therefore, was not just a story of greed and corruption, but also a story of cultural transmission and intellectual appropriation. The untold secret of the dissolution is not just the scale of the looting, but the profound and lasting impact that this illicit redistribution of wealth had on Tudor society. It was a process that was messy, brutal, and often illegal, but it was also a process that helped to create the conditions for the emergence of a new and dynamic England, a nation where old certainties were being swept away, and where new fortunes, both material and intellectual, were being forged in the crucible of religious and political revolution. Part 5. The Boy King's Radicals, Edward VI Protestant Underground. The reign of Edward VI, the boy king who ascended to the throne at the tender age of 9, is often portrayed as a brief and unstable interlude, a period of radical Protestant reform driven by the ambitions of his powerful uncles, the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Northumberland. While it is true that these men wielded immense power and were instrumental in shaping the religious policies of the reign, to see Edward as a mere puppet is to overlook the existence of a vibrant and intellectually sophisticated Protestant underground, a network of radical preachers, scholars, and activists who saw in the young king's accession an opportunity to create a truly godly commonwealth. This was not a top-down reformation imposed by the will of the political elite, but a grassroots movement fueled by a fervent and often revolutionary zeal that sought to purge England of all vestiges of Roman Catholicism and to build a new Jerusalem in its place. Edward himself, far from being a passive observer, was a precocious and deeply pious youth who was a true believer in the Protestant cause. His education had been entrusted to a group of humanist scholars with strong reformist sympathies, and he had been steeped in the writings of the Continental Reformers from a young age. He was not just a king in name, but an active and engaged participant in the theological debates of his time. A young man who believed that he had been chosen by God to lead his people out of the darkness of popish superstition and into the light of the true gospel. This royal patronage, however sincere, was only one part of the story. The real engine of the Edwardian Reformation was the network of radical preachers who fanned out across the country, their sermons delivered not just in the pulpits of the great cathedrals, but in market squares, in private homes, and in clandestine gatherings in the back rooms of taverns. Men like John Knox, the fiery Scottish reformer who would later become a key figure in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and Hugh Latimer, the eloquent and charismatic Bishop of Worcester, were not just content with the moderate reforms of the Henrician Church. They were demanding a root and branch purification, a complete and uncompromising break with the past. They preached against the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They denounced the use of images and icons as idolatry, and they called for the abolition of the traditional clerical vestments, which they saw as the livery of the Antichrist. This was a message that resonated with a growing number of people, particularly in London and the southeast of England, where literacy rates were higher and where there was a long tradition of anti-clerical sentiment. The printing press became a powerful weapon in the hands of these radicals, churning out a flood of pamphlets, ballads, and woodcuts that satirized the old religion and promoted the new. These were not dry theological treatises, but a lively and often scurrilous form of popular propaganda, designed to be accessible to a wide audience and to stir up public opinion against the remaining vestiges of Catholicism. The iconoclasm that swept through many parts of England during Edward's reign was not just an officially sanctioned policy of the government, but a spontaneous and often violent expression of this popular religious fervor. Mobs of zealous Protestants would storm into churches, smashing stained glass windows, defacing statues, and whitewashing over medieval wall paintings in a symbolic act of purging the sacred space of its popish defilements. This Protestant underground was not a monolithic movement, however. It was a diverse and often fractious coalition of different groups, each with its own particular theological emphasis and its own vision for the future of the English Church. There were the mainstream reformers like Archbishop Cranmer, who sought to create a church that was both Protestant in its theology and English in its character, a church that would be a model for the rest of Europe. But there were also more radical groups influenced by the Anabaptist and Zwinglian traditions of the Continental Reformation, who rejected the very idea of a state church and who called for a complete separation of church and state. These groups, often meeting in secret and practicing their own forms of worship, were a source of concern not just for the conservative opponents of the Reformation, but also for the Protestant establishment itself, who feared that their radicalism would discredit the entire reform movement and lead to social and political instability. The untold secret of the Edwardian Reformation is that it was far more radical, more popular, and more contested than is often acknowledged. It was not just a story of political maneuvering and theological debate at the highest levels of church and state, but a story of a vibrant and dynamic Protestant underground, a movement of true believers who were prepared to risk everything for their vision of a godly England. This was a vision that was only partially realized during Edward's brief reign, and it was a vision that would be brutally suppressed during the Catholic reaction under his sister Mary. But it was a vision that would not die, and it would re-emerge, transformed and re-energized, during the reign of Elizabeth I, to become one of the defining forces in the making of modern England. Part 6. Jane Grey's 9-Day Reign, a Conspiracy of Scholars. The tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, the 9-Day Queen, is traditionally cast as a tale of innocent youth manipulated by the cynical and power-hungry ambitions of her father-in-law, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. She is the Protestant martyr, the bookish and pious young woman who was an unwilling pawn in a ruthless game of thrones, a victim of the dynastic turmoil that followed the death of Edward VI. While there is undoubtedly much truth in this portrayal, to see Jane as merely a passive victim is to ignore the intellectual and ideological forces that propelled her to the throne, and to overlook the existence of a powerful and influential circle of humanist scholars and evangelical reformers who saw in her accession not just a political opportunity, but the culmination of a decades-long project to create a truly godly and learned monarchy. This was not simply a coup d'etat orchestrated by a single ambitious nobleman, but a conspiracy of scholars, a carefully planned, an ideologically motivated attempt to place a fellow intellectual and true believer on the throne of England. Jane was not chosen by Northumberland simply because of her Tudor bloodline, although that was, of course, a necessary prerequisite. She was chosen because she was the living embodiment of the humanist ideal of the educated and virtuous ruler, a young woman who had been meticulously groomed for power by some of the leading intellectuals of her day. Her education, which was famously rigorous and comprehensive, was not just an anachronism, a curious exception to the general rule of female subservience. It was a deliberate and politically motivated project designed to create a monarch who would be not just a figurehead, but an active and engaged leader in the cause of religious and intellectual reform. Her tutors, including John Aylmer, who would later become the Bishop of London, were all committed evangelicals and leading figures in the English humanist movement. They saw in Jane a prodigious intellect and a sincere piety, a young woman who could be molded into the perfect Protestant queen. She was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She had read the classical authors in the original, and she was well versed in the theological debates of the Reformation. She was, in short, everything that the Reformers had dreamed of in a monarch, a stark contrast to the Catholic and, in their view, intellectually inferior Mary Tudor. The plot to place Jane on the throne was therefore not just about securing the power of the Dudley family, but about securing the future of the English Reformation. For the circle of scholars and reformers who surrounded Jane, her accession was a divine mandate, a providential opportunity to create a new kind of monarchy, one that would be based not on the old medieval ideas of hereditary right and sacred kingship, but on the new humanist ideals of reason, virtue, and learning. This was a radical and revolutionary idea, and it was one that they were prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to achieve. The document that Edward VI signed on his deathbed, the devise for the succession, which bypassed his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth and named Jane as his heir, was not simply the product of Northumberland's manipulation of a dying boy. It was a carefully drafted legal and theological argument, a document that drew on the latest thinking of the Protestant reformers to justify a radical break with the established laws of succession. It argued that Mary and Elizabeth, as the children of marriages that had been declared invalid, were illegitimate, and that Mary, as a Catholic, was unfit to rule a Protestant nation. It was a bold and audacious move, and it was one that was undergirded by a powerful sense of ideological conviction. The 9 days that Jane spent as queen were not, as is often imagined, a period of fear and uncertainty. They were a period of intense activity, a brief and tantalizing glimpse of what a humanist monarchy might look like. Jane took her role as queen with the utmost seriousness. She attended council meetings, she signed state papers, and she engaged in theological debates with her chaplains. She was not a puppet, but a queen in her own right, a woman who was determined to live up to the high expectations that had been placed upon her. The failure of the coup was not due to any lack of conviction on the part of Jane or her supporters, but to the overwhelming popular support for Mary, a support that was based not on any intellectual or ideological commitment, but on the simple and powerful appeal of hereditary right. The people of England, for the most part, were not ready for a philosopher queen. They wanted the rightful heir, the daughter of the beloved Catherine of Aragon. The untold secret of Jane Grey's 9-day reign is that it was not just a tragic footnote in the history of the Tudors, but a pivotal moment in the intellectual and political history of England. It was the high watermark of the English humanist movement, a bold and ultimately unsuccessful attempt to create a new kind of monarchy. And it was a story not just of a victim, but of a young woman of extraordinary courage and conviction, a scholar queen who was prepared to die for her beliefs and who, in her brief and tragic reign, left an indelible mark on the imagination of a nation. Part 7. Bloody Mary's Phantom Pregnancies, the Politics of Hysteria. The reign of Mary I, forever stigmatized by the moniker Bloody Mary, is a period of English history that is almost universally associated with religious persecution and the brutal burning of Protestant martyrs. While the Marian persecutions were undoubtedly a dark and terrible chapter, to focus solely on the fires of Smithfield is to miss a more subtle, and in many ways, more revealing aspect of her reign: the 2 phantom pregnancies that consumed the queen and her court in a bizarre and tragic spectacle of hope, delusion, and political desperation. These were not simply the personal tragedies of a middle-aged woman desperate for a child, but highly public and intensely politicized events that exposed the deep-seated anxieties of a regime struggling for legitimacy and survival. Mary's first pregnancy, announced in the autumn of 1554, was greeted with an outpouring of official celebration and genuine popular joy. Church bells rang, bonfires were lit, and Te Deums were sung. In churches across the land, for a nation that had been rocked by the religious and political upheavals of the previous 2 reigns, the prospect of a Catholic heir was a promise of stability, a return to the old ways, and a definitive end to the Protestant experiment. For Mary herself, it was a personal and a political triumph, a sign of God's favor upon her marriage to Philip of Spain, and a vindication of her lifelong commitment to the Catholic faith. As the months wore on, however, and the Queen's belly swelled, a sense of unease began to creep into the court. The expected date of delivery came and went, yet there was no sign of the royal infant. Ambassadors sent anxious dispatches back to their home courts, their reports filled with a mixture of official optimism and private doubt. The Queen, secluded in her chambers, remained convinced that she was with child, her physicians and ladies-in-waiting seemingly powerless to contradict her. This was not simply a case of wishful thinking. It was a collective delusion, a mass hysteria that was fueled by the intense political pressure to produce an heir. The entire legitimacy of the Marian regime, its very future, rested on the Queen's ability to provide a Catholic successor who would secure the country for Rome and prevent the Protestant Elizabeth from ever ascending to the throne. The phantom pregnancy, therefore, became a political necessity, a truth that had to be willed into existence, regardless of the biological reality. The court was trapped in a web of its own making, forced to perpetuate a fiction that was becoming increasingly untenable with each passing day. When the truth could no longer be denied, when it became clear that there was no baby, the sense of anticlimax and national humiliation was profound. The bonfires were extinguished, the celebratory ballads fell silent, and the court was plunged into a state of deep and bitter disappointment. For Mary, it was a devastating personal and political blow, a public repudiation of her hopes and a sign, perhaps, that God's favor was not as certain as she had believed. The second phantom pregnancy, in 1557, was a tragic replay of a first, a desperate and almost pathetic attempt to recapture the hope and optimism of the earlier years. This time, however, the public reaction was more muted, the celebrations more restrained. The court and the country had been through this before, and there was a sense of weary skepticism, a feeling that they were all actors in a play that they had already seen. The Queen, now in her 40s and in failing health, clung to the belief that she was pregnant with an almost feverish intensity, her delusion a poignant and desperate denial of her own mortality and the impending failure of her Catholic restoration. The untold secret of Mary's phantom pregnancies is not just the medical mystery of what caused them, whether it was a case of pseudocyesis, a psychological condition that mimics the symptoms of pregnancy, or a more complex medical issue. The real secret is what these events reveal about the politics of the Marian court, the way in which the female body of the monarch became a site of intense political and religious anxiety. In a patriarchal society that valued female rulers primarily for their ability to produce male heirs, Mary's barrenness was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political crisis. It was a crisis that her government and her supporters tried to solve through a collective act of will, a desperate attempt to impose a narrative of fertility and dynastic succession onto a body that refused to cooperate. The phantom pregnancies, in the end, were a powerful and poignant symbol of the ultimate failure of the Marian regime, a regime that was built on a foundation of wishful thinking and a desperate desire to turn back the clock, a regime that was ultimately unable to produce a future for itself. They are a reminder that the great events of history are not just shaped by battles and acts of parliament, but also by the intimate and often tragic realities of the human body, and by the powerful and often irrational forces of hope, fear, and belief. Part 8. Elizabeth's Spy Network, Walsingham's Invisible Web. The reign of Elizabeth I, often celebrated as a golden age of cultural flourishing and national confidence, was also an era of unprecedented and pervasive espionage, a time when the threat of assassination, foreign invasion, and domestic rebellion was a constant and palpable reality. At the center of this shadow world was Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary and spy master. a man of austere Protestant piety and ruthless political pragmatism who constructed a vast and sophisticated intelligence network that was the envy of Europe. This was not the romanticized world of dashing spies and cloak-and-dagger escapades, but a grim and methodical business of surveillance, interception, and disinformation, a bureaucracy of secrets that was as essential to the survival of the Elizabethan state as the Royal Navy. Walsingham's genius lay in his understanding that information was power, and he dedicated his life to the systematic and relentless acquisition of it. He operated on the principle that it was better to know too much than too little, and his network of agents, informers, and cryptographers extended across the continent, from the royal courts of Paris and Madrid to the back alleys of Rome and the seminaries of Douai, where English Catholic priests were being trained to return to their homeland as missionaries and, in Walsingham's view, as potential subversives. He was a master of the dark arts of espionage, employing a range of techniques that were both innovative and chillingly effective. His agents were a motley crew of disaffected courtiers, Catholic exiles willing to betray their co-religionists for a price, and professional spies who were motivated by a mixture of patriotism, profit, and a love of the game itself. He was one of the first spy masters to make extensive use of ciphers and codes, and he employed a team of brilliant cryptographers, most notably Thomas Philippes, who were able to break even the most complex of enemy codes, providing Walsingham with a constant stream of high-grade intelligence. The interception and deciphering of the correspondence of Mary, Queen of Scots, was Walsingham's greatest triumph, a masterpiece of counterespionage that ultimately led to her trial and execution. He did not just passively intercept her letters. He actively manipulated the channels of communication, allowing her to believe that she was corresponding in secret with her supporters, while all the while he was reading her every word, and in some cases, even adding his own postscripts to encourage her to incriminate herself further. This was a morally ambiguous and deeply cynical strategy, but for Walsingham, the ends always justified the means. The preservation of the Queen's life and the security of the Protestant state were, in his view, a sacred duty that overrode all other considerations. Walsingham's network was not just focused on high-level political and military intelligence. He also operated a vast domestic surveillance operation, a system of informers and agent provocateurs who monitored the activities of English Catholics, Puritan radicals, and anyone else who was deemed to be a potential threat to the established order. He was a pioneer of the mole, placing agents within Catholic households and seditious groups who would report back on their activities and, in some cases, actively encourage them to commit acts of treason that would lead to their arrest and execution. This created a climate of fear and suspicion, a sense that the state had eyes and ears everywhere, a feeling that no one could be trusted, and that even the most private of conversations could be reported back to the authorities. The financial cost of this vast intelligence operation was enormous, and Walsingham was constantly petitioning the Queen for more funds. Elizabeth, with her notorious parsimony, was often reluctant to provide the resources he needed, and Walsingham was frequently forced to use his own money to pay his agents and to fund his operations. This was not just a matter of professional pride. It was a reflection of his deep and unwavering commitment to the cause. He was a man possessed, a religious zealot who saw the struggle against Catholic Spain and the forces of the Counter-Reformation as a holy war, a cosmic battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. The untold secret of Walsingham's invisible web is not just its size and sophistication, but the extent to which it shaped the political and psychological landscape of Elizabethan England. It was a system that was built on a foundation of mistrust and deception, a system that blurred the lines between loyalty and betrayal, between patriotism and paranoia. It was a system that was instrumental in preserving the life of the Queen and the security of the realm, but it was also a system that came at a considerable moral and human cost. It is a reminder that the Golden Age of Elizabeth was not just a time of poetry and exploration, but also a time of deep and abiding fear, a time when the preservation of the state was seen as a matter of life and death, and when the dark and secret world of the spy was an essential and accepted part of the machinery of government. Part 9. The Tudor Navy's Dark Secret, Piracy and the Slave Trade. The glorious narrative of the Tudor navy, immortalized in the triumphant defeat of the Spanish Armada, and the daring exploits of circumnavigators like Sir Francis Drake, conceals a much darker and more troubling secret: its deep and inextricable entanglement with the brutal worlds of piracy and the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. The celebrated sea dogs of the Elizabethan era, often lauded as national heroes and patriotic adventurers, were, in reality, a complex and morally ambiguous breed of men, part privateer, part pirate, and pioneering figures in the trafficking of enslaved Africans. This was not a peripheral or shameful aspect of Tudor maritime enterprise, but a central and highly profitable component of England's rise as a naval power, a secret that was condoned and often actively encouraged by the highest levels of the Elizabethan state, including the Queen herself. The origins of this illicit partnership can be traced to the early years of Elizabeth's reign, a time when England was a relatively minor and financially insecure nation, overshadowed by the immense wealth and power of Catholic Spain, the vast riches that Spain was extracting from its American colonies. The gold and silver of the Aztecs and the Incas were a source of both envy and anxiety for the English. Unable to challenge Spanish dominance through conventional warfare, Elizabeth and her council turned to a more clandestine and morally flexible strategy: a state-sponsored campaign of piracy and plunder against the Spanish treasure fleets. Men like John Hawkins and Francis Drake were not just independent adventurers. They were, in effect, agents of the state, their voyages often funded by a syndicate of investors that included prominent courtiers, government ministers, and even the Queen herself, who would receive a significant share of the profits. This was a high-risk, high-reward enterprise, and the line between legitimate privateering, the licensed raiding of enemy shipping in times of war, and outright piracy was often deliberately blurred. The Tudor state provided the legal and political cover, the sea dogs provided the daring and the naval expertise, and the result was a massive and illicit transfer of wealth from the Spanish Empire to the English crown and its favored subjects. The immense fortune that Drake brought back from his circumnavigation of the globe, a haul that was said to be worth more than the entire annual revenue of the English government, was not just the product of exploration and trade. It was the product of a series of audacious and brutal raids on Spanish shipping and colonial settlements. This state-sponsored piracy, however, was only one half of the dark secret of the Tudor Navy. The other half was its pioneering role in the English slave trade. It was John Hawkins who, in the 1560s, made the first English voyages to West Africa to capture and enslave Africans, whom he then transported across the Atlantic to sell to the Spanish colonists in the Caribbean. These voyages, which were notoriously brutal and inhumane, were also highly profitable, and they laid the foundations for what would become a vast and lucrative trade in human beings. Hawkins, far from being condemned for his actions, was celebrated as a hero, his coat of arms even featuring a bound African slave. His voyages were, like those of the privateers, a joint venture between the Sea Dogs and the Elizabethan establishment. The Queen herself provided him with ships, including the ironically named Jesus of Lubeck, and she was a major investor in his slaving expeditions. The untold secret of the Tudor Navy is the extent to which these two illicit activities, piracy and the slave trade, were intertwined and mutually reinforcing. The profits from slaving were used to finance privateering expeditions, and the ships and crews that were used in the slave trade were also used to raid Spanish shipping. It was a vicious and profitable cycle, a dark and bloody business that enriched the English elite and helped to finance the growth of the Royal Navy. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the defining moment in the history of the Tudor Navy, cannot be fully understood without acknowledging this dark and secret history. The ships that faced the Spanish fleet were not just manned by patriotic Englishmen defending their homeland, they were manned by seasoned sailors who had honed their skills and their ruthlessness in the brutal worlds of the privateering raid and the slaving voyage. The victory over the Armada was not just a triumph of English courage and naval strategy. It was also a victory for a system of state-sponsored piracy and human exploitation that had been flourishing for decades. It is a reminder that the foundations of England's maritime and imperial power were not just laid in the glorious battles of the high seas, but also in the dark and secret holds of the slave ships and in the bloody and brutal raids of the pirate captains. It is a secret that has been conveniently forgotten in the heroic narratives of the Tudor age, but it is a secret that is essential to understanding the true and complex origins of England's rise to global power. Part 10. The Cult of Gloriana, Magic and Astrology in Elizabeth's Court. The court of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, is often presented as a realm of high culture, Renaissance poetry, and burgeoning national pride, a world shaped by the political acumen of William Cecil and the military prowess of Francis Drake. Yet, beneath this veneer of rational statesmanship and Protestant piety, there existed a parallel world of magic, astrology, and esoteric belief. A hidden realm of influence that was not only tolerated but actively embraced by the Queen herself. The cult of Gloriana, the carefully constructed public image of Elizabeth as a semi-divine and almost magical figure, was not just a product of poetic flattery and political propaganda. It was also deeply rooted in the occult philosophies of the age, a world where the lines between science, magic, and religion were fluid and interconnected. At the heart of this secret world was John Dee, the Queen's personal astrologer and one of the most brilliant and enigmatic figures of the Elizabethan era. Dee was not a charlatan or simple fortune teller. He was a mathematical genius, a renowned cartographer, and one of the most learned men in England, his library at Mortlake being one of the largest and most impressive in Europe. He was also a deeply committed practitioner of what he called angel magic, a complex and highly ritualized system of scrying and angelic communication that he believed would unlock the hidden secrets of the universe and provide him with divine guidance. For years, Dee and his associate, the spirit medium Edward Kelly, conducted a series of bizarre and intense seances in which they claimed to be in direct communication with angels who revealed to them a secret celestial language and a series of prophecies about the future of England and the fate of the Queen. This may seem to us like a descent into madness or self-delusion, but for Dee, and for many of his contemporaries, it was a legitimate and deeply serious form of scientific and spiritual inquiry. The crucial point is that Elizabeth not only knew about Dee's magical practices, but she actively sought his counsel and his services. It was Dee who was called upon to cast a horoscope to determine the most auspicious date for her coronation, a decision of immense political and symbolic importance. It was Dee who provided the Queen with astrological and alchemical advice, who drew up navigational charts for her explorers based on his esoteric knowledge, and who used his magical and intelligence-gathering skills to serve the interests of the state. He was, in effect, a secret and unofficial minister, a magical advisor whose influence extended into the highest echelons of power. The Queen's reliance on Dee was not an isolated eccentricity. It was a reflection of the widespread belief in astrology and the occult that permeated Elizabethan society. From the common people to the educated elite, the world was seen as a complex web of hidden correspondences and cosmic influences, a universe where the movements of the planets could foretell the fate of nations and where a properly trained magus could harness the secret forces of nature to achieve his goals. This belief system was not necessarily seen as being in conflict with Protestant Christianity. For many, like Dee, it was a way of understanding the divine order of the universe, of reading God's second book, the Book of Nature. The cult of Gloriana, therefore, needs to be understood in this context. It was not just a political strategy, but a magical one, an attempt to invest the Queen with a supernatural aura, to portray her as a figure who was in harmony with the celestial powers and who was destined to lead her people to a golden age. The poets and playwrights of the age, like Edmund Spenser in his epic poem, The Faerie Queen, were not just writing flattering allegories. They were participating in this magical project, weaving a web of symbolism and esoteric imagery around the Queen that was designed to enhance her power and to protect her from her enemies. The untold secret of Elizabeth's court is the extent to which this magical worldview was a central and integral part of its political and cultural life. It was a secret that was hidden in plain sight in the symbolism of the court portraits, in the allegories of the court masks, and in the private consultations between the Queen and her astrologer. It is a secret that challenges our modern and rationalist assumptions about the past, and it reveals a world where the boundaries between the real and the supernatural were far more permeable than we can easily imagine. It is a reminder that the Elizabethan age, for all its brilliance and modernity, was also an age of deep and abiding mystery, an age when the fate of a nation could be decided not just in the council chamber or on the battlefield, but in the cryptic pronouncements of the stars and the whispered conversations with angels. Part 11. The Other Tudors, Illegitimate Heirs, and Hidden Bloodlines. The Tudor dynasty, with its notoriously fraught and often bloody history of succession, presented to the world a carefully curated image of a single, legitimate bloodline, a fragile thread of royal inheritance that was constantly under threat, but ultimately preserved through divine providence. Yet, behind this official narrative of legitimacy, there existed a shadowy and often deliberately obscured world of other Tudors, a network of illegitimate children, secret marriages, and hidden bloodlines that posed a constant, if often unspoken, threat to the stability of the throne. These were the Tudors who were written out of the official histories, their claims ignored, their existences often a source of deep anxiety and political embarrassment for the reigning monarchs. The most prominent of these other Tudors was Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son of Henry VIII and his mistress, Elizabeth Blunt. Fitzroy, whose surname literally means son of the king, was not just a bastard in the shadows. He was a publicly acknowledged and much-loved son, showered with titles, including Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and given a royal upbringing. For a time, particularly during the years when Henry was desperately seeking a male heir from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Fitzroy was seen as a viable, if constitutionally problematic, potential successor to the throne. The king even contemplated legitimizing him, an act that would have been a radical and unprecedented move, but one that demonstrated the depth of his desire to secure the Tudor line. Fitzroy's early death from consumption at the age of 17 was not just a personal tragedy for the king. It was a political crisis, a what-if of history that could have dramatically altered the course of the English Reformation and the subsequent reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. The existence of Fitzroy highlights the central paradox of the Tudor succession, the obsessive and often brutal quest for a legitimate male heir coexisted with the reality of a monarch who was more than capable of producing healthy and intelligent sons outside the bonds of marriage. Henry VIII was not the only Tudor monarch to have a complicated and clandestine family life. His daughter, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, was the subject of constant and often salacious rumors about her love life and the possibility of secret children. While there is no definitive evidence to support these claims, the very persistence of the rumors is a testament to the deep-seated anxiety that surrounded the succession and the Queen's refusal to marry. The most famous of these rumors concerned her relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, her lifelong favorite, and, in the eyes of many, the love of her life. The possibility that Elizabeth may have had a secret child with Dudley, a child who would have been a claimant to the throne, was a political bombshell that could have plunged the country into civil war. The existence of a hidden Tudor bloodline, therefore, was not just a matter of court gossip. It was a matter of national security. Beyond the immediate royal family, the Tudor bloodline had also been extended and complicated through the marriages of Henry VII's daughters, Margaret and Mary. Margaret's marriage to the Scottish king, James IV, would ultimately lead to the Stuart succession, but it also created a complex and often rivalrous relationship between the two royal houses. Mary's secret and scandalous marriage to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, produced two daughters, Frances and Eleanor, whose descendants, most notably Lady Jane Grey and the Seymour family, would become major players in the dangerous game of Tudor succession politics. These were the other Tudors, the legitimate, but often politically inconvenient, branches of the royal family who represented an alternative line of succession and a potential threat to the reigning monarch. The untold secret of the other Tudors is the extent to which the fear of these hidden and rival bloodlines shaped the political and personal decisions of the Tudor monarchs. It was a fear that fueled Henry VIII's obsessive quest for a male heir, that drove him to execute two of his wives and to break with the Church of Rome. It was a fear that lay behind the ruthless and often paranoid politics of the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, as different factions vied for control of the succession, and it was a fear that haunted the long and seemingly glorious reign of Elizabeth I, forcing her to navigate a treacherous path between the competing claims of her various cousins and to live with the constant threat of a disputed succession. The story of the Tudors is not just the story of the kings and queens who wore the crown. It is also the story of the ones who were hidden in the shadows. The illegitimate sons, the secret lovers, and the inconvenient cousins whose very existence was a reminder of the fragile and often arbitrary nature of royal power, and whose hidden bloodlines were a constant and unsettling presence in the secret history of the Tudor court. Part 12. The Essex Rebellion, a coup d'état gone wrong. The Essex Rebellion of 1601, the final and most dramatic political crisis of Elizabeth I's long reign, is often portrayed as the tragic and reckless gamble of a fallen favorite, the desperate last act of a charismatic but fatally flawed nobleman, Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex. It is the story of a personal and political rivalry with Robert Cecil, the Queen's brilliant but physically unprepossessing chief minister, a clash of personalities and ambitions that ultimately led to Essex's ill-fated march on London and his subsequent execution for treason. While this narrative of personal rivalry and tragic hubris is undoubtedly a key part of the story, to see the Essex Rebellion as simply the product of one man's ambition is to misunderstand the deep and widespread political and social discontent that was simmering beneath the surface of late Elizabethan England. The rebellion was not just a rash and ill-conceived adventure. It was a genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempt at a coup d'état, a conspiracy that involved not just a handful of disaffected courtiers, but a significant and powerful faction of the nobility, the military, and even the cultural elite, who saw in Essex their last best hope for a change of regime. The late 1590s were a period of profound crisis for England. The country was bogged down in a long and costly war in Ireland, a conflict that was draining the treasury and claiming the lives of thousands of English soldiers. The economy was in a deep recession, exacerbated by a series of failed harvests and widespread poverty. And the Queen, now in her late 60s, was seen by many as being out of touch, a remote and increasingly indecisive ruler who was overly reliant on the cautious and, in the eyes of the Essex faction, corrupt and self-serving council of Robert Cecil and his allies. Essex, in contrast, was the epitome of the swashbuckling and charismatic military hero, the darling of the people, and the champion of a more aggressive and expansionist foreign policy. He was the last of the great Elizabethan adventurers, a man who seemed to embody the heroic spirit of the Armada years, a spirit that many felt had been lost in the cautious and bureaucratic world of the Sicilian regime. The conspiracy that formed around Essex was therefore not just about advancing his own personal ambitions. It was about a fundamental disagreement over the future direction of the country. It was a clash between two competing visions of England, the Sicilian vision of a stable, peace-loving, and fiscally responsible state, and the Essexian vision of a more glorious, martial, and expansionist empire. The plotters who gathered at Essex House in the winter of 1600 to 1601 were not just a rabble of discontented soldiers. They were some of the most powerful and influential men in the kingdom, including the Earl of Southampton, the patron of William Shakespeare, and a host of other nobles and military captains who were veterans of the wars in France, the Netherlands, and Ireland. They believed that the Sicilian regime was not just incompetent but actively corrupt, and that the only way to save England from ruin was to remove Cecil and his faction from power, by force if necessary, and to place Essex at the head of a new government. The plan was not to overthrow the Queen, but to stage a palace coup, to seize control of the court and to force Elizabeth to dismiss Cecil and to appoint Essex as her chief minister. It was a high-stakes gamble, and it was one that was based on a fundamental miscalculation, the belief that the people of London would rise up in support of their hero. On the fateful day of the rebellion, when Essex and his followers marched into the city, they were met not with the popular uprising they had expected, but with a mixture of confusion, apathy, and fear. The Londoners, for all their love of Essex, were not prepared to risk their lives and property in a civil war. The rebellion quickly collapsed and Essex was arrested and charged with treason. The untold secret of the Essex Rebellion is the extent to which it was a near-run thing, a genuine and credible threat to the stability of the Elizabethan state. It was not just a romantic and foolish escapade, but a serious political conspiracy that came perilously close to success. It was also a cultural phenomenon, a rebellion that was played out not just in the streets of London, but also on the stage of the Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare's company was paid by the conspirators to perform a special production of Richard II, a play about the deposition of a weak and ineffectual king. In a clear and deliberate act of political propaganda, the failure of the rebellion and the execution of Essex marked the end of an era, the end of the swashbuckling and heroic age of Elizabeth, and the triumph of the more cautious and bureaucratic world of Robert Cecil. Was a victory for the state over the charismatic individual, for the pen over the sword, and it was a stark and brutal reminder that in the high-stakes game of Tudor politics, there was no room for glorious failure, and that the final and most important secret of power was the ability to hold on to it at any cost. Part 13. The Irish Wars, a Tudor Vietnam. The 9 Years' War in Ireland, which raged from 1594 to 1603, was the longest, most expensive, and bloodiest conflict of Elizabeth I's reign, a brutal and intractable war that has been aptly described as the Tudors' Vietnam. This was not the glorious and heroic warfare of the Spanish Armada, but a grim and dirty war of attrition. A counterinsurgency campaign fought in the bogs and forests of Gaelic Ireland against a sophisticated and elusive enemy, a war that exposed the limits of English power and the dark and brutal underbelly of Tudor colonialism. The official narrative of the war, as presented in the dispatches of English commanders and the chronicles of the time, was of a civilizing mission, a righteous struggle to bring English law, order, and true religion to a savage and rebellious people. The reality, as revealed in the private letters of the soldiers and the Gaelic Irish sources, was a far more complex and horrific story of scorched earth tactics, mass starvation, and systematic ethnic cleansing. The war was not just a conflict between two armies. It was a clash of two cultures, two legal systems, and two ways of life. For the English, Ireland was a wild and untamed frontier, a place to be conquered, planted, and civilized. For the Gaelic Irish, it was their ancestral homeland, a rich and ancient culture that was under threat from a foreign and rapacious invader. The leader of the Irish Confederacy, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, was not the primitive chieftain of English propaganda. He was a brilliant and modern military commander, a man who had been educated at the English court and who understood the intricacies of European politics. He was able to unite the disparate and often warring Irish clans into a formidable military alliance, and he was able to secure significant military and financial support from England's great enemy, Spain. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, using his intimate knowledge of the Irish terrain to ambush English columns, to cut their supply lines, and to wage a war of psychological terror that sapped the morale of the English soldiers. The English response to this new and terrifying form of warfare was a policy of systematic and deliberate brutality. Unable to defeat the Irish in open battle, English commanders like Lord Mountjoy and Sir George Carew resorted to a strategy of terror and famine. They burned crops, slaughtered livestock, and systematically destroyed the food supplies of the civilian population in a deliberate attempt to starve the rebels into submission. This was not the incidental collateral damage of war. It was a calculated and officially sanctioned policy of extermination, a belief that the only way to pacify Ireland was to destroy the very fabric of Gaelic society. The letters and diaries of the English soldiers who fought in Ireland are a chilling testament to the brutalizing effects of this kind of warfare. They speak of a land that had been reduced to a barren wasteland, of a people who were forced to eat weeds and grass to survive, and of a moral landscape where the old certainties of chivalry and honorable combat had been replaced by a new and terrifying logic of total war. The financial cost of the war was staggering, consuming a vast portion of the Elizabethan government's revenue and pushing the country to the brink of bankruptcy. The human cost was even greater. it is estimated that as many as 100,000 people, the vast majority of them Irish civilians, died as a result of the conflict, a demographic catastrophe that left a deep and lasting scar on the Irish psyche. The untold secret of the Irish Wars is not just the scale of the brutality, but the extent to which this conflict was a crucible for the development of the English colonial mindset. It was in Ireland that the English first developed and refined the techniques of conquest, plantation, and cultural annihilation that they would later apply with such devastating effect in North America and beyond. The idea of the savage native, the belief in the inherent superiority of English civilization, and the justification of violence in the name of progress were all forged in the bloody and brutal laboratory of the Irish Wars. The war also had a profound and destabilizing effect on English politics. The failure of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, to defeat the Irish rebels was a major factor in his downfall and his subsequent rebellion. The war created a generation of battle-hardened and often deeply traumatized soldiers, men who would return to England with a new and more cynical understanding of the realities of power and violence. The 9 Years' War, therefore, was not just a peripheral colonial conflict. It was a central and defining event of the late Tudor period, a secret and shameful war that has been largely written out of the triumphant narrative of the Elizabethan Golden Age. It is a stark and uncomfortable reminder that the foundations of the British Empire were not just laid in the glorious voyages of exploration and the great victories at sea, but also in the muddy and blood-soaked fields of Ireland, in a war that was as brutal and as morally compromising as any in English history. Part 14. The Queen's Doctors, Medicine, Alchemy, and the Elixir of Life. The medical world of the Tudor court was a bizarre and often contradictory realm, a place where cutting-edge Renaissance science coexisted with ancient folk remedies, where university-trained physicians consulted astrological charts before prescribing treatments, and where the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life was considered a legitimate, if secret, branch of medical research. The health of the monarch was a matter of supreme state importance, and the Queen's doctors were not just medical practitioners, they were powerful and influential figures at court, men who held the life of the sovereign in their hands, and whose advice could have profound political and dynastic consequences. This was particularly true during the long reign of Elizabeth I, a queen who was notoriously guarded about her health, and who presided over a medical establishment that was a fascinating and often bewildering mixture of the rational and the magical, the official face of Tudor. Medicine was represented by the Royal College of Physicians, a prestigious and highly exclusive institution that was dominated by men who had been trained in the classical medical traditions of Galen and Hippocrates. These learned doctors believed that the human body was composed of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humors. Their treatments, which included bloodletting, purging, and the prescription of complex and often disgusting concoctions of herbs, animal parts, and minerals, were all designed to restore the body's humoral balance. This was a system of medicine that was based more on tradition and theory than on empirical observation, and its effectiveness was, to say the least, highly questionable. Yet for the Tudor elite, it was the only respectable and officially sanctioned form of medicine, a sign of one's education and social status. Alongside this official medical establishment, however, there existed a vibrant and often clandestine world of alternative and magical healing. This was the world of the alchemists, the astrologers, and the cunning folk, a world that was often dismissed by the learned physicians as mere superstition, but one that held a powerful and enduring appeal, even for the most educated and sophisticated members of the Tudor court. The belief that the health of the human body was intimately connected to the movements of the celestial bodies was widespread, and even the most orthodox of physicians would often consult a patient's horoscope before making a diagnosis. The alchemists, with their secret and obsessive quest to transmute base metals into gold and to discover the elixir of life, a substance that would grant immortality, were also seen as being at the forefront of medical research. Their laboratories, with their strange and exotic equipment, were not just seen as places of magical fantasy, they were seen as pioneering research. Facilities, places where the secret and hidden properties of nature could be unlocked for the benefit of humankind. Queen Elizabeth herself, a woman of sharp intellect and a healthy skepticism, was also a product of her age, and she was not immune to the appeal of this magical and esoteric world. While she maintained a team of official physicians from the Royal College, she also consulted with a range of less orthodox practitioners, including the famous astrologer and magus, John Dee. She was fascinated by alchemy and was a patron of several alchemical projects, her interest driven not just by the prospect of financial gain, but also by the hope that the alchemists might discover new and powerful medicines that could prolong her life and preserve her health. The Queen's famous and almost obsessive preoccupation with her personal appearance, her use of heavy white makeup to conceal the scars of smallpox and the ravages of age, was not just a matter of personal vanity, it was also a political strategy, an attempt to project an image of timeless and almost immortal beauty, to embody the cult of Gloriana, the ageless and semi-divine Virgin Queen. The untold secret of the Queen's doctors is the extent to which they were participants in this magical and political project. Their role was not just to treat her physical ailments, but also to help her maintain this carefully constructed image of eternal youth and vitality. They were the guardians of the royal body, a body that was not just a private and personal space, but a potent symbol of the health and stability of the nation. The secrecy and anxiety that surrounded the Queen's health, the constant rumors and speculations about her illnesses and her ability to bear children, were a reflection of the deep and abiding connection between the body of the monarch and the body politic. The world of Tudor medicine, therefore, was a world of secrets and shadows, a world where the lines between science and magic were constantly being blurred. It is a reminder that the quest for health and longevity is one of the most ancient and powerful of human desires, and that in the Tudor age, this quest was pursued not just in the sick room and the apothecary's shop, but also in the alchemist's laboratory and in the secret and mysterious world of the stars. Part 15. The Succession Crisis, James I and the Secret Tudor Will. The peaceful accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne as James I in 1603 is often presented as the inevitable and foreordained conclusion of the Tudor story, the smooth and logical transition from one dynasty to the next. This narrative of seamless continuity, however, conceals a decade of intense and clandestine political maneuvering, a secret and high-stakes diplomatic game that was played out in the shadows of the aging Elizabeth I's court, a game in which the fate of the nation hung in the balance. At the heart of this secret struggle was a constitutional time bomb, a legal and political conundrum that had been created by none other than Henry VIII himself. His last will and testament, a document that had been enshrined in an Act of Parliament and which explicitly excluded the Stuart line, the descendants of his elder sister Margaret, from the English succession. According to the strict letter of the law, the rightful heir to the English throne after Elizabeth was not James VI of Scotland, but one of the descendants of Henry's younger sister, Mary, a group that included the politically inconvenient and, in the eyes of many, dangerously Catholic members of the Seymour and Grey families. This legal and political reality created a situation of profound and dangerous uncertainty. For Robert Cecil, the brilliant and pragmatic chief minister of the dying Queen, the prospect of a disputed succession was a nightmare scenario, a recipe for civil war and foreign intervention. He knew that James, as the King of Scotland and a Protestant with two healthy sons, was the only candidate who could guarantee a peaceful and stable transition of power. The problem was how to circumvent Henry VIII's will and to secure the throne for a man who was, in the eyes of the law, a foreigner and a usurper. The solution was a secret and highly illegal correspondence, a conspiracy of two, in which Cecil, without the knowledge or consent of his queen, entered into a clandestine negotiation with James to manage his accession to the English throne. This was a breathtakingly audacious and politically risky gamble. If Elizabeth had discovered that her chief minister was secretly corresponding with her heir, it would have been an act of treason, and Cecil would have almost certainly ended his career on the executioner's block. For 2 years, From 1601 until the Queen's death in 1603, Cecil and James exchanged a series of secret letters, written in cipher and carried by a trusted intermediary. In these letters, Cecil acted as James's secret agent at the English court, providing him with detailed intelligence on the shifting political factions, advising him on how to win the support of key figures, and most importantly, coaching him on how to manage his relationship with the notoriously prickly and unpredictable Elizabeth. He instructed James on what to write in his official letters to the Queen, what tone to adopt, and what subjects to avoid, all with the aim of reassuring her of his loyalty and affection, while at the same time subtly advancing his own claim to the succession. It was a masterful and deeply cynical exercise in political stage management, a secret and invisible government that was preparing for the transfer of power long before the old Queen had breathed her last. The untold secret of the succession crisis is the extent to which Robert Cecil, the quintessential Tudor statesman, was the architect of the Stuart succession. He was the man who, through a secret and illegal act of political foresight, defused a constitutional crisis and ensured that the transition of power would be peaceful and bloodless. He was the man who, in effect, chose the next king of England. The story of this secret correspondence also reveals a great deal about the character of the two men involved. It shows Cecil as a man of supreme political skill and ruthless pragmatism, a man who was willing to risk everything, including his own life, to preserve the stability of the state. And it shows James as a shrewd and canny politician, a man who, despite his reputation for intellectual vanity and personal weakness, was more than capable of playing the long and patient game of high-stakes diplomacy. The peaceful accession of James I, therefore, was not an accident of history. It was the result of a carefully planned and brilliantly executed secret operation, a final and posthumous triumph. For the Tudor school of statecraft, it was a secret that was kept for centuries, a secret that is a powerful reminder that the great and public events of history are often shaped by the secret and private actions of a few powerful individuals, and at the end of the Tudor dynasty was not just a matter of fate and genealogy, but of a secret and audacious political conspiracy that has been largely written out of the official histories. Thanks for uncovering these Tudor secrets with us. If you were shocked by what you learned, hit the like button, subscribe for more hidden histories, and let us know in the comments which secret surprised you the most. Stay curious and question everything you thought you knew about the past.